Now let's turn to the evolving workforce. So we hear a lot about younger generations coming up through the workforce, having different attitudes and motivations from their older colleagues. So since TR2050, Total Rewards 2050, is about the future reward, let's look at those coming generations, Generation Z, Gen Alpha, and beyond, whatever labels we give them. We will have a separate discussion with younger voices, so students, undergrads, postgrads, but let's hear from a slightly older panel. So, what do coming generations want from employers as best you can read? And what do they want from reward? So Billy, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think I previewed it a little bit. A lot of these, I think, generational storylines make for good headlines. They're kind of clickbaity. And then I think when you actually drill down into the data, some of those three core components that I mentioned, I think are universal regardless of age, which is fair competitive pay, opportunity, and great people to work with. I said line manager before, but I think something, yeah, exactly, which is a cultural element. I think one thing that does show up in the data is that the younger generations are fairly keen to work for companies with a purpose. That we see that in consumer behavior, given the choice of choosing between three products. If there's a particular company that has a mission statement or a purpose that that aligns with them better, they will make shopping decisions based on that. And I think we're starting to see that as well in terms of becoming an employer of choice. And I think with that comes, and it's not just having a splashy marketing, landing page that says we do all these things. I think what consumers and employees are starting to expect is some traction on these things. Is that if you say that you're going to have a greenhouse gas emissions target, are you going to hit it, and what are you actually doing to achieve that? And we see that sort of across, not just having something that's good enough on the website, but how are you going to actually measure against that? So I'm not sure what to think about a lot of this generational data, but I'm dubious that you could really carve up people into these big buckets. I think also people don't really like being labeled. And say, and I fall into kind of a tweener where, based on my birth date, I'm not quite Gen X and I'm not quite millennial. And so I kind of take what I need from both. I mean, my professional career started, which it was a very in-person environment. We joked a little bit earlier about the technology, though I feel like I'm dating myself. But, when you first started, you were given a desktop computer. As you kind of earned trust and earned competency and you started traveling for work, you were given a laptop because you actually needed it. And then when you really, really made it, you were given a BlackBerry, but it was sort of it was earned based on kind of trust and performance. And that shifted a lot in terms of the expectations. Like, I'm not going to earn working from home. I want to work from home, and I'm only going to work for companies that provide me with a remote experience. Cool. That's a choice. And that's a decision point between the company and the associate on what that contract might look like and what the differences might be in terms of having an in-person experience. So I think there's some really interesting data around this, but I think I'm going to kind of take the glass half full and say there's more that unites us than I think divides us in terms of some of these generational cutoffs.
Really interesting. I've got to confess, I'll put my cards on the table here. Looking at the academic data, so there's a couple of observations. One, we've got very little data, proper data on what the younger generations want. Two, if you look at social psychology, the biggest factor affecting behavior is context, not age, not generational age, and not personality. So interesting. A lot of this is about the culture of the organization, actually. So great, thank you. Stacey, what are your thoughts on this?
I couldn't agree with you more as it relates to breaking down generational preferences. I think one thing I will observe is there is a very strong connection for most of the folks that we hire to our mission. And our mission is very much connected to the communities in which we serve.
Right.
And so from a total rewards perspective and from an engagement perspective, I have the privilege of attending our new hire orientations, and we talk a lot about all of the values and what we stand for as an organization, and we give a lot of examples from the very beginning around the work that we do, not only with our team members, but what we do on behalf of our communities in partnership with the communities that we serve. And it really goes to show for our team members coming in how we think of them as the community and they serve the communities in which they work.
So they have multiple roles, right? They're
Absolutely.
employees, they're healthcare workers,
And they're
they're
patients.
members of the community, and patients, right?
Absolutely.
So multiple hats.
Yep.
Great.
And it really does go a long way for us to show the commitment and how much we are investing not only in our team members, but in the communities in which we serve to elevate health. And I think that's a huge attractor, and I think it goes beyond dollars and cents for them, and is a great way to differentiate us, I think, from our competitors and from other organizations.
So this point about multiple social identities that each of us has, right, is really interesting. Coming back to this, the trap of putting people in buckets, right? So there's some really interesting data on how the older generation's attitudes, I'll pick a topic, right, to the environment and climate crisis, and I see this in myself, are affected by their kids. So I pay more attention to climate because my kids are bothered about it, right? And I'm their parents, so guess what? I identify strongly with them. So it's a really interesting pattern there. Manjit, what would you like to add to
So
this?
ditto to everything I've heard so far. I agree pretty strongly that we should avoid kind of overgeneralizing. I don't think any particular generation, there's themes obviously, but one size fits all, and I don't think any particular person wants the same things through their entire career or their entire life cycle, regardless of what generation you are. So I think there's some things with with upcoming generations that are more inherent to them than maybe they were in the past. So, the expectation of flexibility, just because they've grown up with it, they're not going to have grown up in the era that a lot of us did, where it was just a standard to be in the office every single day. So the kind of expectation of flexibility probably is more inherent. I think they're digital natives. They also didn't grow up as, some of us got computers like halfway through high school or whatever it may be, right? So they're used to that. The concept of work from anywhere and all of those things. I think the mission-based focus is absolutely a real thing for many in this generation. So I think there's some things, but at the end of the day, I think all people want consistent things, and one of them is security. So at the end of the day, my 17-year-old daughter wants to work from a van. She wants to do some sort of, do something that's going to allow her to never sit in front of Teams all day like I do. And, she wants to make amazing money traveling the country in a van. That's great, as long as you can pay your bills and make it work. Right. At some point in time, right, underemployment might become an issue, and she maybe, start thinking of, so I think there's definitely a journey. It's important to understand the things that are, different about each generation. But at the end of the day, I think you called it, right? I think there's a fair competitive pay, be able to meet your basic needs becomes a thing, career development and not being isolated. And sometimes you're going to want mentorship and you're going to want, and so I think people evolve. And it's just important to keep an open mind that it's not going to be one size fits all, and it's not going to be one and done.
Great, thank you. Hem, I think you mentioned earlier that the average age of Moderna's employees is 38?
38.
So what's your take on this, given that employee base?
I find it interesting at this moment in time where lots of total rewards practitioners are talking about personalization and ROI. Yet here we are having a discussion about throwing a blanket over an entire generation and saying this is what they would like. It's completely counter to everything we're talking about.
Cross purposes, yes.
So again, I think I've often thought about these things much more about life cycle stage than age.
Yes.
Like that's much more important. That's the context that you're living in.
So echoes of Manjit there about where are you in your journey?
Yeah. And risk appetite. So depending on where you are in your life cycle stage, you're going to have a different risk appetite because you may have people relying on you. You may be looking after parents. You may be looking after kids, or you may have none of that. And again, it just depends on your point around context. I think is infinitely more important, and context is almost by definition individual. It's your experiences in your current context is going to drive what you want. And yes, sure, there is going to be some similarities, but I think that's again more based on life cycle stage, because before you hit 18, you generally have more risk appetite than you do later on in life. So I think that, that's always been the case, and plus ça change, I think that's what you said.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Hem. Asha, I think average age was 32 in
early
Shopify?
30s.
32,
early
okay.
30s.
Yeah.
So a couple of different things here. I'm very much like Billy here, somewhere between the millennial or the Gen X kind of a thing. Have a Gen Z daughter and an Alpha son. So we have a lot of generational conversations at home. And then I turn it over to like my workplace as well. So a couple things that I always notice is meeting people where they are. I think that is going to be the key aspect of the future generation is they are, when you think about the context in which they are growing up, they're a lot more curious, they are a lot more opinionated, and we are actually raising them to self-advocate for everything. So when they go into the workforce, they're going to bring all that with them. So it's not going to be dropped off at college. They're going to bring it with them to the workforce, right? So meeting them where they are, providing them the agency and the choices is going to become more critical. There was a whole generation which thought of going to work and getting paid for it as I go here for a paycheck. Now we're raising a whole different generation which thinks about what you get from the company in the form of total rewards, as we call it in a very nice way now, as a culmination of money, benefits, perks, how you treat me, where do I get to work from? And there are so many different angles how they look at it as. It's no longer, I go to work for a paycheck. So you're addressing a whole different generation that you yourselves are raising. So we need to be able to take a step back and think about how they're going to look at what we offer them from a total rewards perspective. And we also don't often give credit enough to the younger generation in terms of how adaptable they actually are. So our generation went through the pandemic and we had to one day go from being at work to working from home. I cried for a whole week because that was not my thing. But now I'm kind of like, I work for a 100% remote company. I'm like very well adjusted. I've learned how to build relationships.
Look how much you've changed over a relatively short period of time.
Exactly. So think of the younger generation, they're even more adaptable. So we have to kind of give them credit for that and understand that they will continue to be adaptable. So as things change, whether it's through technology or through climate or whatever it is, as long as we meet them where they are and provide those choices and agency for everybody, because everybody is an individual. This whole individual identity is getting stronger and stronger as the generations are going by. And we cannot ignore that, because total rewards is a big part of why people show up. And what we give them to take home looks very different than it looked 20 years back or 30 years back. So.
Thank you. I love the additional slant you've brought to this discussion. So I think I can confidently say that I'm older than all of you. So when I joined the workforce, the contract that you described of you go to work and you go to work for a paycheck, right, was very much the implicit contract. And implicit in that is also the power relationship to the employer and the employee. And you're implying a very different power relationship between these kids coming in and how we as employers have to change our stance in meet them where you are, to use your phrase, right? So it's interesting, don't put them in buckets, meet them where they are, try and understand them, and change the balance of conversation. That's sort of where you're going with this, right?
Absolutely. And there is nothing wrong from the generation which took work and pay as it's for a paycheck. There is nothing wrong with that.
And that was a point in time.
There's absolutely nothing wrong in saying I need more than just a paycheck to show up at work. Yeah. It's all a balance, and it's about where the culture of the society is going as well. And there is also a lot of economic impact into the future generations, and so much change that goes through as well. So we have to take all of that into account as well as we think about the future of total rewards for this younger generation. It's no longer writing a paycheck and it deposits in your bank and then you don't have to talk about it. How much did we even talk about benefits back in the days? It didn't. It was just more about your compensation is what it was. And now why do we say total rewards? It's because there is so much more to it. Yeah. And it could come for us, we are a 100% remote company, so we are digital by design. That is a benefit.
Yes.
That is a benefit, and how do we talk about that? And that's important for some people, and for some people maybe it's not, and it's okay. So there's so much variability as well. So meeting people where they are is going to be the key of the future.
Great. Again, thank you for this conversation. Anyone want to add anything to spark from the thoughts of the conversation we've gone? No? Cool. Great. Let's move on. Let's build on this idea of workforce and generations. So let's move on from the generations to the gig workforce, which offers, on the one hand, for employers, it's attractive, right? Flexibility, cost savings, access to talent, but also it poses some challenges, right? Relating on the point of view of employees, potentially, depending on power. Job security, do I get benefits? What about underemployment? Am I being exploited? And again, there are different types of gig workers, but how might this tension between the attractiveness of gig workers to employers versus meeting the wants and needs of potential gig employees, how do you think this tension might play out? Where shall I go? Manjit.
Yeah. This is a tough one. So I think we're going to watch it evolve. I think we don't know exactly where it's going to go, but obviously I think it's clear from all the trends that we're moving in the direction of the gig workforce. I think it's a matter of, I alluded to this earlier, even the younger generation right now, or whoever it may be, want the flexibility that comes with it. They want all the things that come with it, but there's also pitfalls.
Yes.
So when they're there, right, they're going to need to be addressed. And it's going to be a competitive market for that talent. So I think the companies that are going to do well are going to be the ones that understand the wants and the needs and understand what the challenges are and try to fill some of the gaps. So, for instance, I think one of the things we hear a lot about is kind of feeling isolated and feeling the need for connection.
Yes.
and lacking that. So what can companies do to, have a core workforce that's your workforce, then you have this kind of gig workforce, but at the same time build connections, build some sort of connection and glue to the company. Can you do mentorship programs? Like, what are the different types of things? Can you offer some sort of skills development? So it's kind of crossing over and trying to create connections, but whatever the gap is, understanding it and trying to address it versus just looking at the two as segmented and completely separate.
Quite interesting. I've done some work recently in the construction sector, and they're talking about this thing called the hybrid enterprise. So it's sort of like an integrated supply chain where you've got a prime contractor and then you've got suppliers, but the employees and the suppliers, or the gig employees and the suppliers, the identity they share actually blurs into the prime contractor. So, so employees, gig employees, signing up to work for a supplier and then spending their whole contractual life with the prime contractor, right? So their identity is actually bound to the prime, not to their employer, right? So really interesting. And you start getting to things like, you've talked about connection, we talked about purpose, right? What is it that binds you to this enterprise? And I'm using the word enterprise very loosely, right? Because it's like a collection of enterprises. It's an ecosystem actually, and you could healthcare, nutrition, moving people, right? Whatever it is, whatever your mission is, right? It's quite interesting. It becomes quite abstract actually. So thank you, Manjit. Hem, what are your thoughts on this?
So, for transparency, it's not something I've spent a great deal of time thinking about. I think the things, as I'm hearing the discussion, the things around purpose and incentives really strike me as those things need to be unpacked. Right. Because you need whether they're doing small pieces of work for an organization, you want people doing their best work. Right. Whether they're your gig workers or your employees or contractors or whatever it is whatever hat they have. You want people doing their best work, performing at their best. We work on an underlying assumption or hypothesis that people work when they see purpose, when they feel connected, when they have incentive to do their best work. And I don't know what that looks like for a gig worker. just haven't. I mean, there is definitely obvious. We're all people. Gig workers are people too, and so they have purpose, and they have. And I think we'd need to really understand and unpack that before we then start designing programs around it, because that's always been the case. Everything we do in Total Rewards is trying to solve for those things. We're trying to get people to perform and feel so that they have impact, and it's an ROI. So I don't know. I think that's a lot of, like, we need to kind of almost go back to first principles before we start designing and thinking about what does rewards look like for that population.
Fascinating, really thought-provoking. So let me say, from the academic behavioral research, I would say, from what I know of it, it supports your hypothesis, right? People crave meaning. For example, they will work harder when they connect their work to some higher purpose, meaning, whatever word you want to use. And I think Manjit used the word use cases earlier. Effectively, you're saying, so what's the use case here? How does this show up for a gig worker? What does purpose mean, actually?
Right.
And how do I connect it to ROI? So great, thank you. Billy.
I'd say somewhat similar to Hem, not a topic that I deal with a lot. Right. But I think where my brain goes again is when we say gig worker, how new of a concept is this? There's plenty of companies who have seasonal workforces.
Yes.
And
farmers,
big box companies, landscaping companies, amusement parks. I was trying to think about different examples, but there's natural moments where demand is up and you need to hire people. You have a core, and then you flex up and down. So isn't that the same thing? And so, my first instinct would be to talk to companies that have kind of gone through that. What does their onboarding experience look like? Right. Is it important for the company to provide that onboarding experience that they give to all of their associates? Do they want the contractors or the gig workers, or even your third-party partners, your consultants, to have access to that cultural aspect of your company? Is it important? Do they even care, right? So I think a lot of this comes down to mutuality, which is a principle at Mars. The mutuality principle is, what is the associate or what is the gig worker looking for? What is the company going to provide? And is it a match? And so there's that aspect of it. And the second, I think, is just around kind of transparency. Like, if this is a gig for a moment in time, are we being transparent about that? This is a short-term engagement for a particular purpose and it ends at this moment. If that's the deal and it's mutual, then it seems like it's probably fine. You might want to say, well, could this be an opportunity to move from a gig to a permanent opportunity? Then where my brain goes is like, how different is this from temp to perm hires that we used to use contractors for and stuff like that? So I don't know. I think there's probably a decent amount of evidence and data out there on prior experience and how do you work alongside gig workers, and plenty of examples that we're seeing play out in the marketplace, whether it's Uber or Lyft, and lots of other gig economies that in a lot of ways kind of got stood up very quickly and seems to be operating pretty well. But of course, I don't know a lot of the details behind it, but that's where I would look to first.
Great. Thank you, Billy. Stacey.
We have what I'll call a segment in that healthcare uses per diems quite a bit.
Yeah.
And so we've gone through this in some capacity, and they are supplemental to our full-time, part-time team members, and they go through our orientation, they go through our cultural, if you will, orientation, and we see them as an extension of our workforce versus gig workers, and we hope that they will convert. And so we very much do think about them as employees of the health, of the organization of Northwell, although they may be fully employed elsewhere and working with us for
similar to my
picking up shifts, if you will. But the idea would be for them at some point to not do that and come on board full-time or part-time.
I mean, it's interesting, right? When they show up to patients, the patients think they're Northwell employees, I'm guessing, right?
Yeah.
They don't know that they're agency workers or whatever, right? Okay.
And we do have an agency within Northwell called FlexStaff because we were relying on contract work for such a long time that we created our own agency. And while they may be employed by FlexStaff, they are Northwell employees as well. And so we've already done some work in taking them on, although we may not, they may not participate in all of the rewards programs for full-time and part-time employees. But as it relates to the way in which they engage with our patients and with each other, they are in fact Northwell employees.
Okay, cool. Great. Thank you, Stacey. Really interesting to hear that, to Billy's point, there are already examples we can draw on within your own organization to learn from. Great. Thank you. Asha.
So really quick, like him, we don't really have gig workers in the e-commerce business right now. But one of the things, as I was taking the flight from Charlotte to Boston to fly here, guy sitting next to me just started talking to him, and he said, I work in Alaska during the summer, and then the rest of the year I don't. So I said, so what do you do for the rest of the year? He's like, oh, I just like fly around with my buddies and just play golf. And I got like really, really curious. And like, the tour rewards person in me is very shy of just asking, what do you make? Kind of like, what do you do? Kind of a thing. So anyways, the more I chatted with him, he said he actually goes to Alaska every year for about 3 months of the summer. And fly fishing is what he does. And he flies people over and like people pay like $7,500 to $8,000 per day to kind of do this. So he makes upwards of $400,000 coming out of this. And I was like, wow, that's a really nice gig. But it's like I'm hesitant to even call it a gig because it makes $400,000. Here is an example where it's a gig that's like really, really well paid. Yes. So this guy probably does not care about benefits. No. Right? But when I'm thinking about gig workers, I'm also thinking, gosh, like these are like mostly lower paid jobs, and how do they afford to pay for benefits? Because I live in the United States and we don't have a great national healthcare system. So benefits is like very, very critical for us. So employers should start thinking about potentially meeting people where they are. Again, going back to the original concept of for gig workers, maybe there is an option they can opt into to pay or have benefits for a small fee, because as an organization, you still have buying power and negotiating power to have lower priced healthcare available. Maybe gig workers jump into that in some fashion. You still pay them hourly. But there is some offerings. Like I don't know, like I said, I haven't really done a lot of work on this one, but that's where my head goes when I think about like gig workers. The first thing to me is not about the pay, but it's really about the benefits. Yes. But it's also because I live in the States and I know how expensive healthcare is. Yes. And if you have to go independent, unless you are the guy who flies to Alaska and makes $400,000 a year, I think you would be really worried about the healthcare costs.
So there are gig workers and there are gig workers, clearly.
Yes. And like I said, for a second in my head, I was like, oh, wow. Because he said, I have this gig I do. That was the word he used. And I was like, oh, he's a gig worker. And then I realized, oh my God, this gig worker makes $400,000 a year. And I was like, okay.
I was thinking of like the deadliest catch.
Yeah. Yes. But
did you meet one of them?
That was like, it was very interesting. It really gave me a very different perspective of how we think about gig workers. And what I thought was important was because we started using Instacart quite a bit during the pandemic, and I still continue to use it because I'm lazy. And every time the guy or the gal shows up to deliver groceries, I'm always like thinking, what do you think they got paid because of this? Like, how do they cover their benefits? Or and I'm always chatting. How does this work? I'm always chatting with the Uber drivers to ask, yes. Yes.
What gigs do they have?
Right. And that's what, and to me, it's kind of okay, you can probably have 5 different gigs and make enough money. But then what do you do with benefits? Like, how do you go about doing that? And maybe it's important in some countries. Maybe in countries like Canada where there is national health care, maybe it's not that important. Or maybe somebody is super healthy, they really don't care. So it goes back to meeting people where they are, and companies should think about that when they are thinking about gig workers, especially in industries where that's predominantly going to become the way of life.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Thank you so much, all of you. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you again, Hem, for hosting us. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.